The realtor asked if we had any questions about the garden, and before I could say something reasonable about drainage or fence height, Iris Nakamura put her hand on my arm, looked at the woman holding the property listing, and said, "My boyfriend and I love it. We'd like a second viewing." She said it the way she said most things, quickly and with total conviction, like the sentence had already been fact-checked and approved and the rest of the world was just catching up. I was not her boyfriend. I had been her best friend for 11 years. I had driven her to this viewing because her car was in the shop and she needed someone to test the water pressure in the upstairs bathroom, which she claimed was a 2-person job, which it was not. At no point during the 40-minute drive had she mentioned that I would be arriving in a new role. I did not correct her. The realtor wrote something on her clipboard. Iris squeezed my arm once and walked toward the kitchen to inspect the countertops, and I stood in a stranger's garden on a Saturday afternoon in October, holding a to-go cup of coffee she had bought me that morning, understanding for the first time that the most dangerous sentence in the English language is one your best friend says about you to a third party, without flinching. But to explain how 11 years of careful friendship collapsed in a kitchen that smelled like fresh paint and someone else's future. I need to go back. My name is Ethan Moreau. I'm 37. I manage inventory systems for a regional hardware chain, which is exactly as interesting as it sounds, but pays well enough that I own my apartment, and boring enough that I've never once been asked a follow-up question at a party. I live alone on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse with high ceilings I don't need, a kitchen island I mostly use as a desk, and a window that faces east, which means I wake up to sunlight whether I want to or not. I'm not unhappy. I'm not searching. I'm just a man who built a functional life and occasionally notices, usually around 8 on a Sunday evening, that functional and full are different words. Her name was Iris Nakamura. She was 34, a landscape designer who specialized in residential gardens and had opinions about soil drainage the way some people have opinions about politics. Loudly, specifically, and with a refusal to accept that anyone could reasonably disagree. She had a quick face, the kind that moved through 6 expressions in the time it took most people to land on one, and dark hair she wore in a braid that she pulled over her left shoulder when she was concentrating and flipped behind her back when she was done, like a punctuation mark. She carried a canvas tote bag everywhere, not a fashionable one. A battered cream-colored thing with a broken zipper and a coffee stain near the bottom that she'd had since design school. Inside it, at any given time, were soil samples in labeled plastic bags, a battered field notebook, 2 pens that never worked, and 1 pen that did. The tote went to client meetings, to my apartment, to Sunday brunch, to the hardware store where she bought plants, and I pretended not to watch her evaluate root systems with the focus of a surgeon. That bag was her, overstuffed, slightly chaotic, impossible to organize, completely indispensable. We met because of a parking dispute, 11 years ago. She had reversed into the spot I was pulling into outside a cafe, and when I honked, she got out of her car holding the tote bag and a latte and looked at me with an expression that suggested I was the unreasonable party in this situation. "I was here first," she said. "You reversed into a spot I was already turning into. Reversing is a more committed maneuver. Commitment should be rewarded. That is not how parking works. It is now." I let her have the spot. She bought me a coffee to make up for it, not because she thought she was wrong, she clarified, but because she believed in generous victory. We sat at a pavement table for 2 hours. By the end of it, she had my number, my opinion on 3 different types of gravel, and the first of what would become 11 years of Saturday mornings that I would structure my entire week around, without admitting I was doing it. I have poor survival instincts around women who steal parking spots and then buy you coffee about it. For 11 years, we existed in the space that doesn't have a name, the one between best friend and something else, where you know her coffee order and her sister's birthday, and the exact face she makes when she's about to say something she'll regret. She had a key to my apartment. She used it without warning, usually arriving with the tote bag and a container of whatever she'd cooked that week, setting it on my kitchen island like a supply drop. I never asked her to do this. She never offered to stop. We never discussed what it meant that my fridge was half her cooking and my Sunday mornings were entirely her company. She sat on the floor of my apartment instead of the couch. I'd asked her about it once, early on, and she'd said the couch was too far from the coffee table, which made no sense given the coffee table was directly in front of the couch. But I let it go because the sight of Iris Nakamura cross-legged on my floor, with the field notebook open in her lap and the tote bag slumped against her hip, had become the most reliable image in my weekly rotation, and I was not going to jeopardize it over furniture logistics. She dated. I dated. Neither of us dated well. Her relationships ended after 3 or 4 months with a consistency that suggested a pattern she refused to name. Mine ended similarly, usually around the point when the person I was seeing said something like, "You talk about Iris a lot." And I said, "She's my best friend," and they looked at me the way you look at someone who is technically telling the truth and completely missing the point. My friend Dev told me once, in the specific tone of a man who has been waiting years to say this, "You know she's not just your friend, right?" And I said, "Of course she is." And he said, "Ethan, you meal prep together." And I said, "A lot of friends do that." And he said nothing, which was louder than anything he could have said. That is hiding with better branding. Iris decided to buy a house in September. She'd been renting a flat above a florist. Her bedroom smelled permanently of lilies, which she claimed to hate and I suspected she loved. And she wanted a garden. Not a balcony garden. Not a courtyard. A proper garden she could tear apart and rebuild from the soil up. Something she could design without a client telling her what they wanted. She wanted to build the things she'd been building for other people for a decade, and she wanted it to be hers. She asked me to come to viewings, not as a buyer, as, she said, structural support. What does that mean? It means I need someone who'll check the boiler and tell me if the kitchen has good light. You're a designer. You know more about light than I do. I need moral support that is disguised as practical support. Are you in or not? I was in. Of course I was in. Iris asked, and I showed up. That had been the arrangement for 11 years. I had never examined why too closely, because the answer was sitting in a room I wasn't ready to enter. The October viewing was the third one. The house was a semi-detached Edwardian on a street with mature trees dropping amber leaves across the pavement. The gutters were clogged with them. The front path was carpeted. The air smelled like cold stone and decomposing maple, and the particular woody sweetness that old houses breathe out when the heating first comes on in autumn. Iris picked me up at 9:30. She was wearing a corduroy jacket with the tote bag over one shoulder, the field notebook sticking out of the top. She handed me a coffee through the car window before I'd even sat down. Black. 1 sugar, the way I'd been drinking it since she'd memorized my order in year 1 and never once gotten it wrong. "This one has a 100-foot garden," she said, pulling away from the curb. "Southwest facing. Mature planting. You've said mature planting 3 times this week." "Because it matters 3 times, Moreau." We drove. The trees blurred past in orange and gold. She had the radio on low, something acoustic and warm, and the tote bag sat between us on the console like it always did, the broken zipper gaping open, the field notebook's edge catching the morning light. I looked at the bag and thought about how many times I'd seen it in the passenger seat of her car, and how it had its own place there, and how I had a place there too. and how neither of us had ever named what that meant. The realtor met us at the door. She was polished, efficient, the kind of person who called every room a space and said potential the way other people say please. She led us through the hallway, original tiles, dado rail, the particular stillness of a house between owners, and into the kitchen. The kitchen was good. I knew it was good because Iris went quiet, and Iris only went quiet when something moved her. She ran her hand along the countertop. She looked at the window above the sink, the way the late morning light came through it and fell across the worn wooden floor in long, warm bars. She opened a cabinet, closed it, opened the one next to it. The field notebook came out. The working pen appeared. She started sketching something, a layout, a plan, an idea she hadn't had 30 seconds ago. Then we walked into the garden. It was long and wild and overgrown in the way that happens when someone loved a garden and then stopped being able to tend it. Roses had grown into the fence. A path of cracked flagstones disappeared under ivy. A birch tree at the far end had turned fully gold, and its leaves were falling in the windless air with the slow, deliberate patience of things that know they're being watched. Iris stood at the edge of the patio and didn't move. The tote bag slid off her shoulder onto the ground and she didn't pick it up, which told me everything. Iris Nakamura did not put that bag down. She set it on restaurant floors, on bus seats, on my kitchen island. She held it on her lap during movies. She slept with it next to the bed. The bag going to the ground meant she had forgotten where she was, and Iris only forgot where she was when she'd found where she wanted to be. She turned to look at me. Her eyes were bright, not teary, electric, the expression of someone seeing the answer to a question they'd been carrying for years. Moreau, she said. Just my name. But it sounded different in the garden, heavier, like it was carrying something she hadn't attached to it before. The realtor appeared behind us. It's a special space, isn't it? Do you have any questions? And that's when Iris put her hand on my arm. Not the way you touch a friend, not a tap or a nudge, but a placement. Her fingers resting against my jacket sleeve like they'd found the specific spot they'd been looking for. Looked at the realtor and said, "My boyfriend and I love it. We'd like a second viewing." The word landed in the garden like a stone in still water. I looked at her. She did not look at me. Her hand stayed on my arm. Her jaw was set the way it got when she'd said something on purpose and was prepared to defend it but hoping she wouldn't have to. The realtor smiled and said, "I'll check availability," and went inside. We stood in the garden. The birch leaves kept falling. My arm was very warm where her hand was. "Boyfriend," I said. She picked up the tote bag, brushed the dirt off the bottom, put the notebook back inside. Her movements were precise and unhurried, the way they got when she was buying time. They give couples better slots, she said. Single buyers get the Tuesday afternoon pity viewing. So this is tactical, completely a scheduling strategy. Exactly. She looked at me then. Just for a second, and in that second her face did something it almost never did. It held still. No quick expression. No deflection, no eyebrow. Just Iris, looking at me, with something behind her eyes that was not tactical and not strategic, and not about scheduling at all. Then she looked away and said, "The soil here is perfect for raised beds along the south wall," and walked toward the fence line. And I stood on the patio, holding my coffee, and thinking about a woman who had just called me her boyfriend without asking, and had looked at me like she meant it. This was not a recommended life choice. What I was feeling. I was feeling it anyway. After that viewing, things shifted in the way things do when a word has been said and can't be unsaid. She kept taking me to viewings. She kept calling me her boyfriend. The fourth house. The fifth. The sixth. Each time smooth and certain, and never discussed in the car afterward. I kept not correcting her. We kept not talking about it. The silence around the word grew louder each week until it was the most audible thing in every room we walked through. I started noticing what I had spent years training myself not to notice. The way she always sat closer to me than she needed to during viewings. The way her hand found my arm or my shoulder at exactly the moment the realtor appeared. And how it lingered a full beat after the realtor left. The way she'd started cooking specifically things I liked. My mother's cassoulet recipe, which I'd mentioned once in year 3 and apparently she'd memorized. And a chocolate cake she made for my birthday that was so precise I asked if she'd called my mother, and she said no too fast and changed the subject. One Thursday, she was at my apartment, sitting on the floor with the tote bag and the notebook and a container of soup she'd brought because, she said, I looked tired yesterday, which implied a level of facial surveillance I chose not to interrogate. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at it reflexively. Her screen lit up with my name, but not Ethan. Not Moreau. 2 words, a name she'd chosen for me in her phone that I couldn't read before she grabbed it and flipped it face down. But the first word started with my, and the second was long enough that my brain filled in possibilities I wasn't ready for. Who's that? I said. Spam. Spam addressed to me? It's 2025. Spam is very personalized now. She took an extremely deliberate spoonful of soup and looked at a spot on the wall behind my head with the fixed concentration of a woman who would rather eat wallpaper than continue this conversation. Something in my chest shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough that the apartment felt different. Smaller, warmer, like the walls had moved a half-inch closer while I wasn't looking. 2 weeks later, I was at her flat, picking her up for another viewing, and I arrived early, and her door was open, and I heard her on the phone. Her sister, from the sound of it. Because, I can't just say it, Yumi, we've been friends for 11 years. You don't tell someone after 11 years. A pause. Her voice dropped. I know I called him that. I know. It started as a joke with the realtor, and then it stopped being a joke, and I keep saying it, and he keeps not correcting me, and I don't know if that means something or if he's just being kind, and the floorboard under my foot creaked. Silence. The kind that has a pulse. I'll call you back. I stepped backward. She appeared in the doorway. The tote bag was on her shoulder. The field notebook was in her hand. Her face was performing composure, and her eyes were not. You're early, she said. Traffic was light. How much of that did you hear? Just the tail end. She looked at me. I looked at her. The hallway smelled like lilies from the florist downstairs, and something was happening between us that was too large for the space. Let's go see the house, she said, and walked past me toward the stairs. I followed. Because that's what I'd done for 11 years, Iris walked, and I followed, and I told myself it was friendship, and the hallway smelled like flowers, and something in me had shifted past the point where I could pretend it hadn't. The final viewing was the Edwardian again. The one with the garden. They'd cleared some of the ivy since our first visit, and the flagstone path was visible now, leading to the birch tree that had dropped the last of its gold and stood bare and honest against the November sky. Iris walked the garden slowly this time. No notebook, no pen. Just her and the tote bag in the cold air and the sound of her boots on the flagstones. I stayed on the patio, watching her, not pretending not to. She stopped at the birch tree, She stood with her back to me, her hand on the pale bark, and she was very still. Not sketching, not evaluating, just standing in the space she wanted, the garden she'd been looking for, the place she could finally build something that was entirely hers. And I watched her and thought, she's not looking at this garden like a designer. She's looking at it like someone who's already decided, and the decision isn't about the house. She turned around. Her eyes found mine across the length of the garden. Moreau. Yeah, she walked back up the path. Slowly, the tote bag swung against her hip. When she reached the patio, she didn't sit down. She stood in front of me, close enough that I could see the small scar on her chin from the cycling accident in year 2, and the exact way her braid fell over her left shoulder when she was about to say something that mattered. I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. Okay, I stopped calling you my boyfriend as a tactic around the third viewing. I stopped because it felt right, and because the realtors believed it immediately, and because you never corrected me, and I started wondering if you weren't correcting me because you were being polite or because you didn't want to. She paused. Her hand tightened on the strap of the tote bag. Yumi asked me when it started, and I told her it was the parking lot. 11 years ago, I reversed into your spot, and you honked, and I got out, and I looked at you, and I thought, oh no. That landed. That hit like a sentence that had been sitting behind her teeth for a decade and slipped out before pride could catch it. If you don't feel the same way, she said, her voice steadier than her hands, I will walk back to the car, and we will drive home, and I will never bring it up again. I will still bring you coffee. I will still cook you soup when you look tired. I will still sit on your floor instead of your couch. Nothing changes. She was giving me the door, the exit. 11 years of friendship on one side, the truth on the other, and she was standing there holding both and letting me choose. I didn't take it. Iris, every person I've dated has told me I talk about you too much. Every one. Dev told me 2 years ago that we meal prep together and that friends don't do that. And I said they do, and he just stared at me. I have driven to 6 open houses in 2 months and checked boilers I don't understand and tested water pressure I can't evaluate. And not once, not one single time, did I consider not coming. Because you asked and I showed up, and that has been the entire architecture of my life for 11 years. She was very still. Her eyes were bright and fixed on my face, and her jaw had that set to it. The one that meant she was holding something, fighting something, trying not to let the expression match the scale of what was happening inside. That is a lot of words for a man who checks boilers, she said, but her voice cracked on the last syllable. Just a little, just enough. I'm a very committed structural support. She laughed. It came out shaky and surprised and real. The kind of laugh that sounds like something heavy being put down after years of carrying it. She stepped forward. Her hand came up and rested against my chest. Not pushing, not pulling. Placed, the way you place something when you're checking whether the surface will hold. It held. I put my hand over hers. Her fingers were cold from the November air, and her palm was warm, and the tote bag slid off her shoulder and hit the patio with the soft thud of something that was finally allowed to be set down. The realtor chose that exact moment to open the kitchen door and say, "So, are we thinking of making an offer?" We both looked at her, then at each other. "Yes," Iris said, still looking at me. "We are." The realtor beamed and went to get the paperwork. I don't think she understood what Iris was actually saying yes to. I did. 3 months later, Iris got the keys. I was there when she unlocked the front door for the first time. The garden was bare. Winter had stripped it down to bones, and she stood on the patio and unrolled a plan she'd been working on for weeks. Raised beds along the south wall, a gravel path to replace the flagstones. The birch tree kept exactly where it was. In the corner of the plan, in her handwriting, it said, Moreau's Bench, East Side, Morning Sun. I looked at the plan. I looked at her. You designed me into the garden. You were always in the garden, Moreau. I just finally drew you in. The tote bag got a spot in the hallway of the new house, a hook by the front door, right next to a hook she'd installed for my jacket, without asking whether I'd need one. The field notebook lived on the kitchen counter. The working pen sat in a jar by the window next to a small succulent I'd brought on moving day that she pretended to find sentimental and watered every morning. A year after that, Yumi visited. She walked through the house. She looked at the garden bench on the east side. She looked at the two hooks in the hallway. She looked at us. I knew in the parking lot, she said. She called me that night and described the argument about the parking spot for 20 minutes. Nobody describes a parking dispute for 20 minutes unless they've met someone. Iris turned red. I learned that Iris Nakamura turning red while holding a tote bag with a broken zipper was something I intended to see for the rest of my life. Years later, when people asked how we got together, she always said, I told a realtor he was my boyfriend, and he never corrected me. I figured that was close enough to a yes. And I'd say, she stole my parking spot 11 years ago, and I've been following her around ever since. And she'd look at me with the braid over her left shoulder and the tote bag on her hip and say, Moreau, you were never just structural support. She was right. I wasn't. I was just a man who needed 11 years and 6 open houses and a word spoken to a stranger to understand that the person you show up for without question is the person you've already chosen. It wasn't new. It had probably always been her. What would you have done if your best friend introduced you as her boyfriend to a stranger and didn't take it back? And have you ever spent years showing up for someone before you understood why you never once considered not showing up? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.